I'm Autumn Lockett.
And this is Mitch Randall.
And you're listening to Good Faith Weekly.
Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. And on this episode, Autumn and I are going to talk about the passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We're also going to be talking about the indecision of the grand jury coming out of Louisville, Kentucky regarding Breonna Taylor. And then later on in the pod, we're going to be interviewing our own pastor, Reverend Jakob Topper, as we talk about the importance of ministers taking care of themselves during this pandemic. So stay tuned. Autumn, how are you this week? It's been a tough week.
It has been a tough week. I'm eating my feelings. I'm having some pumpkin bread right now. And so I feel like everyone just needs to take a minute and do something that helps them to feel some solace and some calm. There's, as usual for 2020, there's a lot to be upset about.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Friday night, sitting down to dinner with my family when we got the text the notification, I should say, that Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had passed away. And, you know, not to talk about, we can talk about it here in a moment, about filling her seat, but just the loss in general. She was just a legal giant, a hero for so many people, especially women who practice law. It's just such a great loss.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just, professional women, Jewish women, women in general. And she was just a voice for the marginalized, and her legal mind did a lot for our country. And I think some of what we're grieving right now is the potential loss of some of that hard work that she did.
Right. I mean, such an advocate, a legal advocate for women's equality in the marketplace and in the job place, just continued to stand up and make an argument that women needed to be treated equal as men. And it's hard to believe that when she started her legal career, that women could not get a credit card without having their husband's signature, or a mortgage without having their husband's signature. And she's the one that took the lead and fought before the Supreme Court at the time to bring all of these archaic patriarchal laws to an end and really began to set the stage for true equality in this country. And she was just such a giant. Chief Justice Roberts came out with a great statement talking about what a giant Ruth Bader Ginsburg was, and just such a loss. And everybody is just so sad. Except some people aren't sad, because now this creates an opening on the Supreme Court. And it's just, it's interesting. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's just interesting how politics can be played up on the death of a Supreme Court justice, and we've seen it happen in the last 4 and 5 years. When President Obama was in office, the tragic death of Justice Scalia took place, and Obama attempted to fill Scalia's seat, Scalia being a more conservative judge, and this was 10 months before the election. Brought forth Judge Merrick Garland's nomination, and the Republican-controlled Senate wouldn't even give him a hearing. And now, here we are, 45 days away from another presidential election. The only difference is that there is a Republican president and continued Republican majority in the Senate. And now they're doing everything they can to bring forth a nominee that President Trump will says he's going to name by this weekend. It's just it's really disheartening. I mean, and I know there people play politics all the time in Washington, D.C., but when you see it this blatantly and you see hypocrisy this blatantly, it just discourages the soul, and just really you hang your head and just, it's like, is this what America has come to? Is this where democracy is in 2020?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Yeah.
That's where we are. And we're seeing it, as you alluded to as well, in our justice system.
Yes, absolutely. The indecision by the grand jury in Louisville, Kentucky this week, that the 3 police officers that were involved in the shooting of Breonna Taylor earlier this year none of them were charged with her direct death. There was one charge that they allowed to move forward, and that was disarming a firearm in a harmful way. And
sheetrock matters.
Yeah, right. Because the officer hit sheetrock, and it could have hit somebody else, but nothing regarding the loss of life of Breonna Taylor. I was talking to my college-age son the other day about this, and we were just lamenting about where we are in the state of this country, and that the legal system, there's nothing to be done legally, criminally for Breonna Taylor. And what the crazy thing is that the city of Louisville has already provided a settlement to the Taylor family. They acknowledged that there was a wrong done.
Mm-hmm.
But in another venue, in a criminalized venue, they're saying that there was no criminality done. It makes no sense whatsoever. I was talking to my son about this, and I made the offhand comment, the system is so broken. And this 20-year-old said to me, Dad, the system is not broken. The system is operating exactly the way it was designed.
Spoken like a true Ivy Leaguer.
When he said that, it just resonated with me. He could be no closer to the truth. He is absolutely 100% correct. The
Mm-hmm.
systems that we have in this country were designed to benefit white privilege and to hinder anyone who is a person of color. So when we talk about systemic racism at Good Faith Media, this is exactly what we're talking about. These systems were created hundreds of years ago and modified 150 years ago to benefit the white class in this country. And if you are a black or brown person, the system is going to work against you.
Mm-hmm.
It's simple as that. I'm just really distraught for the future of this country. There is hope. Listening to the words of my son, listening to the words and comments from future generations, that they are not going to stand for the status quo. Regardless of the topic, whether it is climate change, which continues to decline, or systemic racism in some of the institutions that we hold dear in this country, they are not going to let the status quo continue, and they are standing up. They are marching in the streets. I recently read John Meacham's book about John Lewis. His Truth is Marching On. It's a wonderful book. I want to recommend it to everybody. And I was just reminded by Meacham that Lewis, while he was living, especially when he was an 18-year-old and 20-year-old young man, was in the streets risking his life so that his people could be registered to vote. Just such sacrifice, such passion, and we need that passion and sacrifice yet again today.
Yeah, I saw someone wrote, we owe John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg some good trouble. And so I hope everyone will remember that. And, we've taken a minute to sort of catch our breath and lick our wounds, and it's time to get back up and keep marching.
Absolutely. And so I want to encourage everybody that feels like they're in a dark place this week, that feels like the country continues to spiral out of control, that there is no good news. The good news is that you have an opportunity to engage this system. If you believe in democracy, if you believe in decency, if you believe in justice, then get involved. The only way we can change the trajectory that we are currently headed down is if good people get involved and do something. The worst thing can happen is if we just shake our heads and say nothing can be done, and we step aside to let this continue. We can no longer stand aside. We've got to stand up for justice. And a lot of people say, why are you talking about these things? What does this have to do with faith? What does this have to do with gospel? I conclude that this is very much the gospel. Again, I want to go back to Meacham when he was interviewing John Lewis. And Lewis talked about when he was going to seminary in Nashville. He was a ordained Baptist minister. And when he was going to seminary in Nashville, he talked about the disconnect between the seminary at the time, always wanting to talk about the streets of gold. When he said, I believe we should talk about the streets of gold, but I think we also need to be talking about the streets of Nashville, because those two are gospel.
Absolutely.
We've got to stop this nonsense and accepting this false dichotomy that it's got to be talking about spiritual matters or earthly matters, and they do not connect. That is not what God intended. And Jesus himself, when he taught the disciples to pray and gave them the beautiful prayer known as the Lord's Prayer, he says, pray saying, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And he connects the spiritual and the physical. So when we talk about social justice, when we talk about racial justice, when we talk about common decency and the ills of hypocrisy that we see coming out of Washington, D.C., what we are trying to say is that, yes, the streets of gold matter. Yes, we love to contemplate what God is doing, not only in this world, but the world to come. But we have to concentrate on the streets here and now.
You cannot separate the two. And I think that's where a lot of our fellow believers is they're like, yeah, this is horrible. I don't necessarily agree with what's going on, but I'm just going to keep my eyes focused on heaven.
Right. And it's
so not the way Jesus lived.
Yeah. And sometimes the reason I think they do that is because when you put your eyes on heaven solely, that means you don't have to look around. Mm-hmm. And you can be blissfully ignorant to the injustice that are happening in your streets.
And that is privilege.
It is absolutely privilege. Absolutely. So I just want to encourage everybody this week who is feeling down, who's feeling a little bit depressed, get involved.
And eat some pumpkin bread.
And eat pumpkin bread. It's fall, by crying out loud. All right. Well, now we're going to be talking to our pastor, the Reverend Jakob Topper. Jacob recently wrote a wonderful article discussing the importance of self-care for ministers. It's a hard time to be a pastor these days, folks. And so listen to Jacob's words. He's very wise when it comes to this particular topic. And after the interview, call your pastor, write your pastor a letter, or drop by their house and take a meal. And just let them know that you care. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. And on this episode, we've got a very special guest with us and someone that Autumn and I love dearly, our pastor, Reverend Jakob Topper. Jacob is the senior pastor at NorthHaven Church here in Norman, Oklahoma. He hails from the great state of Texas, spending most of his ministry in the Texas Panhandle. He's a graduate of Logston Seminary at Hardin-Simmons University in Abilene, Texas, and from the residency program at Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. His wife, Alyssa, is a licensed physical therapist, and they have one beautiful daughter. Recently, Jacob has written about the struggles of ministry, especially during these days of COVID-19. So, Jacob, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
So good to be here with y'all today. Autumn, Mitch, thanks for having me.
So, Jacob, we've been asking all of our guests here at Good Faith Weekly the very same question to begin with. How are you? How's your family doing during this days of pandemic? Everybody healthy?
You know, my family's doing really well. My wife, my daughter are doing great, both very healthy. My daughter's turned 2 in June, growing like a weed, starting to talk, just enough to scare me. But gratefully, we're in pandemic, so she can't repeat too many things she hears at home out into the world to too many people. So my immediate family's healthy, and man, that ain't nothing right now. That's important. That really is important. My mom had COVID, very serious for about 4 weeks. but she's seems to have kicked that for the most part, still dealing with some respiratory issues in the aftermath of that. But knowing how bad it can go for so many people, this has got a lot to be grateful for right now, a whole lot to be grateful for.
Great.
So would you say that COVID is real?
I hear that it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
At least his mama said it was real.
Never seen the virus with my own two eyes, but I accept it on faith.
Got it.
Well, I'm glad that your family's doing well and your mom's recovering. It's a scary thing when you get that kind of diagnosis. So,
yeah.
Well,
Hi,
let me
Mom. She'll certainly be listening.
Absolutely. Hi, Mom.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the pandemic, and you're the pastor of a church here in Oklahoma. I mean, how has the church handled operating during the pandemic? I mean, obviously, there's going to be challenges during this very difficult time for you and other churches, but also there had to be some opportunities that emerged during this time as well. So just talk to us a little bit about kind of, how things have gone. What are the good things? What are the bad things that you've seen?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. I remember when we first made the decision to not meet in person back in the middle of, I guess it was second week of March. A couple weeks went by, and I remember being in staff meeting and talking with the staff, and they were asking, how long do we need to plan to be in pandemic and or in virtual worship? And somebody said, well, this will probably be like this for another 2 or 3 weeks. Another staff member said that's just crazy. It won't last that long. And I remember being the pessimist that I am, telling the staff, we won't be meeting again in person until at least June or July. And they were shocked by that claim. And then now we're in September and still haven't entered the sanctuary together again. Now we're meeting outside on the lawn for worship, as y'all know, and that seems to be going pretty well. 6 months later, and here we are. It's kind of been a wild ride, one day at a time. But one of the things we learned right off the bat that I personally just thought was so cool is when we were virtual church only, we pre-recorded everything. We didn't meet in the sanctuary and stream it live like some churches did. We recorded different elements in our homes and then sent them in and compiled it all together. And so we had children that were happy to play piano for their mom and a cell phone camera that were not confident or comfortable getting up in front of the whole church in the sanctuary to play the piano or sing and do all this. And so once one kid did something in worship, well, then other kids started wanting to do things as well. And so there's a fantastic video. I don't know if y'all can share this as a part of this clip or not, that I have of Autumn's kids saying the Lord's Prayer together, that your oldest, Autumn, Ava, edited together. She did all the video technical stuff, put it together. The little one sang the Lord's Prayer, and then we included that in worship, which led to another kid seeing it and saying, hey, I would like to play piano. And then another kid saw it and said, well, I would like to sing in worship. And then it came full circle where Autumn shared a picture of her youngest watching the service one Sunday morning as one of the other children was singing, just captivated as Ingrid watched. Who was it? It was Katie. Katie Moore was singing in worship, and there Ingrid is just starstruck watching her, and so it came full circle. So virtual worship allowed us to put children kind of front and center in worship in a way that I just hadn't been able to do at in-person worship before. So that was pretty neat.
So it sounds like, really, obviously, so many distractions with the pandemic going on for churches. But this also is an incredible opportunity for the church to be the church and to open new opportunities, as you just eloquently described, for church members to be involved. And that's been exciting for us to see across the country how churches are adapting their ministry and their worship during this time of pandemic. It really has been inspirational, I guess. And so thanks for sharing that.
Well, as is usually my role, let me take this sunshine you guys are spreading around. Let's look at the darker side of.
Wait a minute. Dun, 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 dun.
I know, right?
Here comes Autumn with the darkness.
It's so usually not me. I'm usually the opposite of this. But Jacob, you have written really some vulnerable words about what it's like to be a minister in general, but especially exacerbated as it has been by COVID. Josh and I served in local churches before he found the law and got us the heck out of there.
I thought you were going to say found the Lord.
Yeah. No, we found the Lord and then we found the law, and that was a better fit for us.
Gotcha.
But it can be so difficult. So what do you think has been the most challenging part of being a minister right now?
Man, it's really hard to narrow that down to one thing or to parse between things. I know that's the question, and I'm revolting against it.
That's fine.
It all has a cumulative effect, right? And so, one real good example of that is I have come out. I've said the phrase Black Lives Matter from the pulpit prior to this year. I said it last year. I said it the year before that, with very little pushback on that. Now, after George Floyd, it seems that everything has been ratcheted up a notch, and for good reason. There's some very serious problems in the world we need to address. And so I spoke to the issue and again explained to my church why I personally say Black Lives Matter. And it was met with some significant resistance from people who heard me say it last year and weren't bothered enough by it to do anything about it last year or the year before. And I see that as all of these things that are going on right now, between living in this hyper-partisan culture, a civil rights movement, the pandemic, the anxiety of one increases the anxiety of the other. So where in the end, we're sitting here with anxiety that's even greater than the sum of its parts. And the sum of its parts is significant all by itself. And so it's almost have a snowball effect, I think, not just on congregants, but on pastors. And we're going through some financial struggles at our church that aren't connected to the pandemic, that just happen to co-align with it. And that's just wonderful too. So the normal stresses of church, which was never, a breeze, it's always been stressful, are still there. And now we have all these other great ones on top of that. And so I think a lot of us are just trying to endure and survive and figure out what it's like walking this road to Calvary. But luckily we've got a pretty good guide on the journey, I guess. There's my spiritual nugget.
It's interesting. When we formed that question, we were really thinking more about kind of the struggles of the pandemic, but you immediately went to the civil rights and racial justice movement that's taking place in the country. All of this, as you said, is happening at the same time. Do you and your colleagues and fellow pastors, are you getting more, are you finding more angst in the civil rights movement or the pandemic, or is it just really all of it working together to just put a weight on your shoulders?
Working together. I think you'd be hard pressed to parse out where the anxiety of one ends and the other begins. Yeah, the water just kind of flows freely back and forth,
Right.
probably.
Right.
Now, I think the civil rights movement is a lot easier thing for people to voice their discontent about, probably,
Mm-hmm.
than the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
The pandemic is something new. We're all, Lord, we don't know what to do. We're doing one day at a time as best we can. I've gotten some pushback for us not being in person in the sanctuary worshiping,
Mm-hmm.
but not a ton of pushback because, worst case scenario is someone dies.
Right.
And so it's hard to argue too strongly with that,
Mm-hmm.
even if you do disagree. But because the world is so hyper partisan right now in America, it's a lot easier to critique a sermon I preach where I explain why I say Black Lives Matter, and let that be the lightning rod that people get to dump all of their anxiety about the pandemic, their fear for their loved ones' lives, all of their angst about our partisan situation, the upcoming election, and there's a rod where you can dump all that anxiety, because maybe I said a phrase not the way you would have said it, or heck, maybe even not the way I would say it, given a second chance. So I see a lot of the angst coming out more from people because of the civil rights movement. But I don't know that that's where the angst originates.
Right.
It's probably easier to voice it around that.
Well, we all know that it is a very difficult time to be a pastor. I mean, you mentioned the pandemic, you mentioned this civil rights, racial justice element or movement that's going through our country right now, the election, the economy. I mean, just so many things. Well, Autumn mentioned a moment ago, you wrote this wonderful article about pastors falling on their swords. And I remember you and I talking about this, that you were having a dialogue with some 10 pastors across denominational lines, and how many of them were extremely vulnerable, talking about not only the possibility of leaving ministry altogether, but some were so distraught that they had even considered suicide. In this time, what are pastors doing to take care of themselves? Because it's it is a hard time for pastors right now.
Yeah. I got to do I don't know if that's the right language, but I officiated a funeral yesterday for a family that got connected with me because of that article. 68-year-old man, pastor of a American Baptist church in the North, killed himself in July. And they didn't know how to do the funeral or memorial service for that really right now. And so then when they read my article, they reached out and asked me to officiate the memorial service. And so I'm going to come back around to your question in a minute.
Yeah, sure.
Mitch. But I'm going to say what I want to say first.
Go right ahead. You're our pastor, so you get to do stuff like that.
Yeah. I'm going to just pretend it's Sunday for a minute. So they asked me to do the memorial service. 68-year-old man who'd been a pastor for almost 40-something years, and he killed himself during this time. This isn't somebody that's young adjusting to it all for the first time. It was just finally too much. And so we're doing a Zoom memorial service, about 15 people, and I got their permission to share this. And they're and I opened it up for them to read letters that they wrote to the deceased or to God, to do poems. Somebody did spoken word that they had written, things that you can't really do at a large funeral, but you can when it's just 15 close family members and friends. And so I saw them lament in the biblical sense of the word, unlike anything I've ever seen before in my life. from cursing God for letting this happen to voicing hope and pleading for God's comfort, all in the same breath, for shaking their fist at the deceased, saying, "Why did you do this to us? And then we miss you so much." It was all a part of it. I mean, there was yelling and tears. I'm still processing. I've never seen anything like it, though. But I think one of the things doing this over Zoom allowed us to do is there's a little bit of distance between me and you on Zoom that's not there when we're in person. Mm-hmm. So I get the advantages of airing my grief and sharing it with someone, but I don't feel so intruded upon that I can't really let it out. Mm. And so what I think I saw right there that I think pastors could really learn a lot from it is learning to voice that lament in a safe space now before it's too late. Yeah. It is finding peers where we can get on the Zoom together and cuss and yell and cry and beg for the Lord to save us, to voice that deep grief and pain that I think everybody is feeling, and pastors certainly aren't.
Having a support group, having a group of colleagues who are in the trenches with you, to be vulnerable and to just talk with one another about the struggles of ministry, I think is vitally, vitally important. I'm so glad that our pastor, you, has that. Yeah. What are some other suggestions that you might have for pastors during this time of difficulty, but also, hopefully one of these days, this too shall pass. And ministry in itself is just difficult. What are some things that, what are some outlets that you have? Okay, good.
It's I'll tell you this. I don't trust another pastor that doesn't go to a counselor. I can't. I don't think I can be honest with another pastor that isn't making their mental health a priority enough to get a professional to help them. We want people to come to us for spiritual needs. Then we've got to be willing to get help from a professional for mental needs. And so I think everybody needs a counselor. Even if you don't think you need a counselor, you need a counselor. There's no exception to that rule now more than ever. And hopefully you'll see the benefit of it now, and we'll continue to do it. Now I know it's not cheap, but I very much believe it could be the difference between life and death for people.
How has it been advantageous for you?
Yeah. So my counselor, I've got a really good counselor. I've found this person after searching, going to a few different ones for a while. I've had a good relationship with several, but this one's very helpful in that they're not a passive listener to my story. So they listen to what I'm going through and then help me to see the truth. That's all. They poke holes in the narrative that I'm telling in ways that it could be self-absorbed sometimes. And so they're very helpful.
You mean pastors are self-absorbed? I don't know what you're talking about, Jakob Topper.
No, they're not. Just me, I'm sure.
No, we all are. I've always said that pastors are some of the most arrogant people, because who in the world thinks that they've got something to say every week and people want to listen to them?
We're one of the top five professions for sociopaths, police officers and pastors. Yeah. So that's just
I can see that.
Awesome.
I can see that.
Lawyers, CEOs, all on the list. So Josh left one sociopathic profession for another.
Okay, he's in good company.
Yeah. So self-pity. I think pastors are very inclined to self-pity, to playing the victim. And so having a counselor who can point out the faulty thinking that makes me miserable is only good for me and my happiness and for the flourishing of my church. So everybody needs a counselor. There's no excuses on that one.
So Jakob, how do you balance your professional and your personal life? Because ministry is overwhelming and the Topper girls are beautiful. So how do you do it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because when we went into virtual church, and we started working from home and worshiping from home and all that, some of the natural boundaries, physical boundaries between work and home eroded immediately. And so I think I'm probably like most pastors that have had to recraft and recreate those healthy boundaries and draw lines between when I'm working and when I'm not. I mean, a pastor is on call 24/7, but not all the things a pastor gets called on 24/7 are emergencies. And so there are things that can wait till tomorrow. So I've just made a habit of, I don't answer text messages or emails after about 6 o'clock. If there's emergency, someone can call me, and they don't tend to call unless it's emergency. I guess that's a cultural thing of right. Today. Now. Sure. And so trying to say, okay, during these hours, I'm dedicated to the church work. But when those hours are over, I'm dedicated to my family, because that's the thing that's going to last.
Well, Jacob, we've got one last question for you before we wrap things up. The question is based on our motto here at Good Faith Media. Our motto is, there is more to tell. And so one of the questions we have for you today is, what is your more to tell?
If you were depressed, get some help. Go to your primary care physician, get a counselor, confide in trusted friends. Don't suffer alone. Email, call. I'm available. I'm volunteering. Mitch. There's just absolutely no reason to suffer alone. There's too many of us suffering to not do it together. And sharing the burden's real important there. Could be life or death.
Good. Those are good words.
And now we're going to let the Lockett kiddos say the Lord's Prayer that Jacob mentioned earlier in the episode, so stay tuned.
Father, who art in heaven, Amen.
Thy kingdom come,
thy will be done
on earth
as it is in heaven.
Give us and stay
our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses,
as we forgive those
who trespass against us.
And lead us not into temptation,
but deliver us from evil.
For thine is the kingdom,
and power,
and the glory,
and glory,
forever.
forever.
Amen.
Amen.